Chancy and the Grand Rascal by Fleischman. 1. The Buckeye Traveler. Pushing his belongings in a squealing wheelbarrow, Chancy set out for the Ohio River 50 miles away. He clicked his heels once or twice and began to whistle through his teeth. His travels had begun. Dawn was aglow behind the Buckeye trees, and roosters were crowing for miles around. When he was out of sight of the Starbuck farmhouse, he pulled off his shoes and added them to the load in the wheelbarrow. He didn't intend to wear out a new pair of shoes by walking in them. The squeak of the old wheelbarrow raised blackbirds along the way. Chancy watched the passing sights with speckled green eyes, cat's eyes, folks called them. He had dark, lanky hair and a nose as thin as a hatchet. He was growing up tall and lean and limber-jointed, but strong as a wire. Jody, his friend Jody Starbuck, was always saying, "Chancy, if you was any skinnier, you'd have to stand twice to throw a shadow." That wasn't precisely true. He could see his shadow moving along the dusty wagon road, keeping him company. He was going to miss Jody, and the squire with his hearty laugh, and Mrs. Starbuck. They had tried to make him one of the family, but even among jolly, big-hearted folks like the Starbucks, he had felt alone. He had felt apart and alone. He had a powerful yearning to find his own kin. Now that he was big enough, he was on his way at last. By dogs. He stopped now and then to spit on his hands. The wheelbarrow was infernally heavy. Mrs. Starbuck was afraid he might starve along the way. It seemed to him she had loaded him up with enough eats to last until he was full grown. In addition to his bedroll, he also had along his pa's 4-pound axe and wedges. He prized that axe. It had a fine black cherry handle, and was all he owned that once belonged to his father. The morning was heating up, but he stepped along steady as a clock. All he had to do was head straight south, and he'd run smack into the Ohio River. Bound to. Couldn't miss it, Squire Starbuck had told him. Then he'd climb aboard a big steamboat, pay his money, and ride all the way to Paducah. That was where his sister was, as far as he knew. He aimed to hunt her up, his sister Indiana. After Indiana, there would be Mirandy to find, and little Jamie, too. Chancy was the oldest of the Dundee children, and he reckoned that made him the head of the family. It was 4 years ago he had last seen his brother and sisters. After the death of their mother, the youngsters had been separated, scattered into the countryside like leaves on the wind. But all through those years, Chancy told himself that when he grew big enough, he'd set out and round them up, Indiana and Mirandy and little Jamie. He was the oldest, wasn't he? And kin belonged together, didn't they? The sun was glowing overhead like a red-hot coal. Suddenly, stones began dropping like meteors out of the clear Ohio sky. 1, 2, 3, they raised blossoms of dust in the road ahead. It gave Chancy a start. He squinted at the sky and then took a backward glance over his shoulder. There, with a handful of pebbles, stood a red-headed boy. A smile sprang toward Chancy's face, but he forced it back. He set down the hot handles of the wheelbarrow and turned. "Jody Starbuck, if I ain't mistaken." "You ain't. What in thunder are you doing way out here? Throwing rocks?" Chancy tried to spit between his teeth, but his mouth was too dry. "You turn around and go on home, Jody." "Not likely." "You ain't coming with me." "Why not?" Chancy took a deep breath. "Your pa will be out looking for you." "We got a right smart head start." "I declare, Jody, do you think your pa won't know where you lit out for?" "I reckon I'd like to see the Ohio River with you, Chancy, and Paducah, and all those fine places you're a-going." Chancy pushed back his straw hat and peered solemnly at the smaller boy standing in the road. He couldn't think of anyone he'd rather have along than his friend Jody. They had slept in the same feather bed for 2 years, and even though Chancy was older, he always treated Jody Starbuck like an equal, but he couldn't let him run away. "The Ohio River?" Chancy scoffed. "Well, that's nothing to see. I'm going to tell you the bottom truth, Jody. That river doesn't amount to a thing. It's just a plain old ditch. Water strung out and trying to look important. It's just plain old ditch water, strung out and trying to look important. You talk like you never seen water in your life, and it's full of alligators. I read that in the almanac, so you know I ain't making it up. Alligators so thick this time of year they jump about like hop toads. You take your life in your hands to come within 10 miles of that old river. I'd like to see an alligator. Chancy sighed and said, Jody, you go on back before the squire takes the hide off you. Chancy lifted the handles of the wheelbarrow and started forward. A few moments later, stones were falling out of the sky again. You want me to push the barrow for you? Jody called. I haven't even begun to get tired, Chancy said. Ma about changed her mind about letting you go. Did she? She wanted Pa to fetch you back, but he said you had a bad case of the yonders and there'd be no keeping you on the farm. He said you can't keep a squirrel on the ground. Chancy headed into the shade of a buckeye tree and stopped. You're following me like a cow's tail. Reckon. Jody, you're going home. And if I have to whip you Jody, you're going home if I have to whip you first. But I guess you can eat with me, unless you ain't hungry. I'm hungry. They rooted around in the wheelbarrow among the fresh biscuits and loaves of salt-rising bread, the jars of preserves, the jug of sweet cider, the hard-boiled eggs, the lump of beef out of the brine barrel, the pickles, the pies, and the cold fried chicken. They started with a peach pie and ended with the cider. Afterwards, they lay in the shade, and Chancy looked over the fallen buckeyes scattered like brown marbles under the tree. Carrying a buckeye was good luck. He picked out a fat round one with a good white eye and began to polish it along the side of his nose. Hot, ain't it? Jody said. I hardly noticed, Chancy answered. That wasn't strictly true. If it got any hotter, the cornfield yonder would break into popcorn. By dogs it was hot, and summer was just beginning. You remember your pa? Chancy merely nodded. He never spoke much about his folks. The Civil War had come and gone, and his father hadn't come back and never would. But Chancy remembered him as clearly as if he were standing there in the road with his doctor bag. In earlier days, when the family was together, they lived up north in Erie County. His father had been killed in the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, but Chancy could still call up the warm, robust sound of his voice. Sometimes, when he was just falling asleep, it came to Chancy as clear as a bell. What if you don't find your sister in Paducah? Jody asked. Do you reckon you'll tow it back here? I reckon I'll just keep looking until I find her. How'd she ever get a name like Indiana? That's where my ma was from, I told you that. They named her after the state. Jody, you're a bear for getting things turned around. Once Indiana was born, they named the state after her. When Chancy had the buckeye polished to a high mahogany sheen, he held it to the sun and studied the ghostly white eye. The war had changed everything. Some months after the word came about his pa, his mother had died of winter fever. Suddenly, Chancy and his younger sisters and brother found themselves alone in the world. A neighbor lady, Mrs. Russell, had tried to find homes for them. Indiana had been the first to be taken away, kicking like a wildcat and calling for Chancy at the top of her voice. He would never forget that day. A chair-bottomer on his way to Paducah had offered to apprentice her and raise her. She'd be 11 now. Chancy remembered him as a turkey-necked man named Jones. Chancy himself had been next to go, leaving little Mirandy and Jamie behind. Where they might be living now, he couldn't guess. Chancy had gone to live in Sandusky with a harness maker. Through the years, Chancy had been passed along from one family to another until he ended up with Jody's folks in the southern part of the state. All the while, he had been marking time, waiting to grow up so he could strike out and find his blood kin. Jody began cracking the joints of his toes. How come you don't have any other folks? I told you, there's Mirandy and little Jamie. He's the youngest. I mean grown-up kin. Chancy slipped the buckeye into his hip pocket. It was time to get moving. I used to have an uncle somewhere. He went out west a long time ago. My Uncle Will. Oh, he was a grand rascal, Mama used to say. But I reckon he got killed in the war, too, or captured by Indians, maybe. Chancy got up. Goodbye, Jody. I'm coming along. Are you going to make me whip you? Reckon so. Chancy slammed his hat to the ground. Jody, you know I can lick you. You start for home. Jody pulled in his neck and began rolling his fists. You aim to whip me or stand there talking all summer? Jody was calling his bluff, and Chancy couldn't think what to do about it. He didn't want to hit Jody. He couldn't. But he couldn't let Jody come along either. Jody, I declare you don't have enough sense to pull in your head when you shut the window. I got sense enough to know there ain't no alligators in the Ohio River. Well, said Chancy, I don't have time to lick you. If you want to know the truth, I'm in a hurry. It won't take long. Jody, get back up that road. Hear me? I mean it. The squire will be out to fetch you before long, and you'll get a real hiding. Chancy's glance lit on his belongings in the wheelbarrow. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you my store-bought teeth. Jody kept his fighting pose, but Chancy saw the effect of his miraculous offer. He dug through his odds and ends and unfolded a blue bandana. He held the false teeth up to the light of day and gave them a clack. Several teeth were broken off, which improved the sinister effect. Jody wanted this rare treasure. He always had. Chancy had found the teeth more than a year before, and when nobody claimed them, the squire let him keep them. They were the envy of every boy in the country, and the guaranteed wonder for scaring girls. Go ahead and take them, Chancy said. They're yours. Jody lowered his fists. Chancy gave the teeth another clack, and Jody took them from his hands. Sure look real, don't they? Practically are, Chancy said. They bit me many a time. He picked up his hat and the handles of the wheelbarrow. If you follow me one more step, I'll take those grinders away from you. He headed back into the sun. He was almost afraid to glance over his shoulder, but when he did, Jody was clacking the teeth and heading for home. Chancy began to whistle again. He felt suddenly that he had outgrown those scary old teeth anyway. He was glad to let Jody have them. 2 days later, he met a one-eyed man. And that's the end of chapter 1.